Hello everyone, today I will give a short, or I'll try to keep it short, talk continuing my loose statistics, risk analysis and probability and coincidence series using US Airways Flight 1549, also known as the Hudson River watering or the Hudson River ditching as an example. Now this is one of the few serious aviation incidents where no one got killed, so I feel it's not too inappropriate to use as an example. However, a few serious injuries as well as quite a bit of psychological damage and material damage was caused, so I still think it's somewhat appropriate to talk through the whole incident briefly before using it as an example for probability and false assumptions in statistics. However, it will not be very detailed, so let me know if you want to know more about the details of the Hudson River ditching. I might make a more detailed video just about this incident. But roughly speaking, in 2009 an Airbus A320 took off from New York carrying an overall of 155 people and encountered a flock of birds and suffered bird strikes in both engines at once, losing all thrust. The pilots then took a left turn to ditch the plane in a river, which is quite an achievement as it is very difficult from a piloting standpoint. You essentially have to ditch a plane perfectly or not at all. If you don't do it perfect, it will just shred the plane to pieces. And they did perfectly. Now there was quite a bit of discussion later and a investigation over whether or not this was the right decision. Since this is just a brief summary, I'll cut it short and say they came to the conclusion that this was the right decision, although it caused some injuries and quite a lot of property damage given that an entire plane was lost. It not only vastly reduced the risk of death for everyone on board, but it also saved anyone off the plane in New York who may have been hit by the plane had it crashed anywhere else than in a river. The passengers got compensated and the entire crew was recognized as heroes, and that's the brief summary of the aftermath that I feel I should mention when talking about this. Now to the actual technical part, why did this happen and why wasn't it anticipated? Now this comes down to basic statistics and maths and to the certification of airplanes and engines considering the risk of bird strikes and thus engine failures, as well as the risk assessment in flight planning. Now part of the point of a two-engine aircraft is that it can return to an airport and land safely using only one engine. If one engine fails, it still has one left. It can still safely return to some nearby airport and land there. And the entire planning is based around the idea that it's incredibly unlikely for both engines to fail at the same time, so even if one fails, you're still safe, and so even though the engine itself, while being reliable, can fail, you're still incredibly safe on board the airplane, and the entire flight plan is based around the idea that in any situation the plane must be able to lose one engine and still be able to save all the passengers and safely land using the remaining engine. The big surprise here was that both engines were lost at exactly the same time, and this has, as I said, to do with statistics and bird strikes. Now there are studies about the frequency of bird strikes, how many birds there are, how likely you are to fly into one, and thus on average how many flight hours it takes statistically until you suffer a bird strike in an engine, and how reliable that engine is considering bird strikes. Of course, the probability of getting a bird strike depends on how big the bird you're anticipating is. Now in the case of the Hudson River ditching, it wasn't really a technical failure. The birds ingested were Canada geese, and these are actually bigger than the size of bird that the engines were designed to safely operate around. So an engine failure was technically expected, or actually basically planned for. It was known that it would be incredibly hard to design an engine that wouldn't suffer an engine failure in this situation, and well, the plan was that one engine would suffer a bird strike and the other engine would be enough to return the plane safely to some airport. And now the problem is that it suffered two bird strikes in both engines at once, and this has to do with how the data of the bird strike probability is analyzed. That is, the assumption is made that these are spread out equally and that each engine independently has a certain risk of suffering a bird strike during some time period. So let's say you fly for 1 hour, and during that one flight hour each engine has a chance of, now this is a very very rough estimate I'm just pulling out of nowhere for an example, but let's say, for example, during that 1 hour each engine has a 1 in 10 million chance of getting hit by a bird. Now the conclusion that the FAA, the EASA, the European version of the FAA, and the engine and airplane manufacturers made was that, well, since the chance for one engine getting hit by a bird is 1 in 10 million in 1 hour, the chance that both engines get hit by a bird within the same hour would be 1 in 100 trillion, obviously. And that would be correct if birds were equally distributed through the sky. But now the problem is that most bird species, certainly Canada geese, have a tendency to flock together during certain times of the year. So they are no longer statistically distributed through the sky, they all travel together in one big flock. So if you are near one Canada goose, the probability that you're also near to another Canada goose is higher than statistical, while if you're far away from one Canada goose, the probability that you're also far away from another Canada goose is also above statistic. They flock together, they're not equally distributed. And so the whole idea of information and probability changes. You now know that once one engine gets hit by a bird, the probability is high that you are in a flock of birds, and that means that the probability is also high that the other engine might also be hit by a bird. They are no longer completely independent systems, and while sometimes that assumption of independent systems is right, you have to challenge it if you are going to use it. You have to make sure that it's actually true. And in this case, it demonstrates how not only a firm understanding of probability, maths, and statistics, but maybe also a consultant from a biology department might have helped making aerospace engineering safer. Now, the mistake here was not an engineering mistake or a piloting mistake or an operation mistake. It was really a mistake in making the safety guidelines for airplanes and making assumptions about how frequent bird strikes are. Although this mistake too is not really a big mistake, a big fault where someone did something stupid, but it was really something that you could overlook, and really one of these unfortunate times where things just are very tricky and they may be obvious in hindsight, but you wouldn't have come up with this before it actually happened. Now, assumptions like this are widespread in technology, and sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. Often when they're wrong, they're recognized as that and corrected. But sometimes they just stay uncorrected, and this is one of the luckily less catastrophic examples, and one of the examples where it was easy to overlook. Many of these mistakes are a lot, say, stupider, if you want to call it like that. Often pieces of equipment are completely independently tested for reliability, and then these are just statistically added up as if they were completely independent. And even obvious ideas like the fact that the entire airplane is probably flying in the same weather as the rest of the airplane often get overlooked, so that some part is reliability tested and it has an overall average reliability, and that is statistically added up in some way of reliability or emergency planning with some other piece of equipment, assuming that they're independent and each just has a certain chance of failing, but then they might both be affected by the weather, so the probability that they both fail at the same time is a lot higher than you would predict from a purely evenly distributed statistic. Although fortunately these more obvious cases are by now pretty much cleared up, at least in terms of aviation safety guidelines. Now I hope you enjoyed this little exemplary introduction in statistics and non-independent events. My next remotely similar video will probably be about another aviation incident which was also incredibly dangerous, but where again no one got harmed due to amazing piloting skills and maybe a little bit of luck, and that time it will be an example to explain some flight dynamics and airplane control concepts. Now, if you have any questions about aerospace engineering, aviation or spaceflight and the physics behind them, I'm always open for any requests, and as always, thanks for watching.